Peter Abelard was a medieval French scholastic philosopher, theologian and preeminent logician. His affair with and love for Héloïse d'Argenteuil has become legendary. The Chambers Biographical Dictionary describes him as the keenest thinker and boldest theologian of the 12th century. Youth Abelard, originally called Pierre Le Palette, was born c. 1079 in Le Palette, about 10 miles east of Nantes, in Brittany, the eldest son of a minor noble Breton family. As a boy, he learned quickly. His father, a knight called Berengar, encouraged Pierre to study the liberal arts, wherein he excelled at the art of dialectic, which, at the time, consisted chiefly of the logic of Aristotle transmitted through Latin channels. Instead of entering a military career, as his father had done, Abelard became an academic. During his early academic pursuits, Abelard wandered throughout France, debating and learning, so as he became such an one as the Peripatetics. Quote, he first studied in the Loire area, where the nominalist Roscellinus of Compiègne, who had been accused of heresy by Anselm, was his teacher during this period. Rise to fame around 1100, Abelard's travels finally brought him to Paris. In the great cathedral school of Notre Dame de Paris, he was taught for a while by William of Champeaux, the disciple of Anselm of Laon, a leading proponent of realism. During this time he changed his surname to Abelard, sometimes written Abelard or Abelardus, retrospectively. Abelard portrays William as having turned from approval to hostility when Abelard proved soon able to defeat the master in argument. Abelard was, however, closer to William's thought than this account suggests, and William thought Abelard was too arrogant. It was during this time that Abelard would provoke quarrels with both William and Roscellinus. Against opposition from the metropolitan teacher, Abelard set up his own school, first at Milan, a favored royal residence, then, around 1102–4. For more direct competition, he moved to Corbeil, nearer Paris. His teaching was notably successful, though for a time he had to give it up and spend time in Brittany, the strain proving too great for his constitution. On his return, after 1108, he found William lecturing at the Hermitage of St. Victor, just outside the Isle de la Cité, and they once again became rivals, with Abelard challenging William over his theory of universals. Abelard was once more victorious, and Abelard was almost able to hold the position of master at Notre Dame. For a short time, however, William was able to prevent Abelard from lecturing in Paris. Abelard accordingly was forced to resume his school at Milan, which he was then able to move from c. 1110–12 to Paris itself, on the heights of Montagne Sainte-Geneviève overlooking Notre Dame. From his success in dialectic, he next turned to theology and in 1113 moved to Laon to attend the lectures of Anselm on biblical exegesis and Christian doctrine. Unimpressed by Anselm's teaching, Abelard began to offer his own lectures on the Book of Ezekiel. Anselm forbade him to continue this teaching, and Abelard returned to Paris where, in around 1115, he became master of Notre Dame and a canon of Sens. Was distinguished in figure and manners. Abelard was seen surrounded by crowds. It is said thousands of students, drawn from all countries by the fame of his teaching, enriched by the offerings of his pupils, and entertained with universal admiration, he came, as he says, to think himself the only undefeated philosopher in the world. But a change in his fortunes was at hand. In his devotion to science, he had always lived a very regular life, enlivened only by philosophical debate. Now, at the height of his fame, he encountered romance. Héloïse d'Argenteuil lived within the precincts of Notre Dame, under the care of her uncle, the secular canon Fulbert. She was remarkable for her knowledge of classical letters, which extended beyond Latin to Greek. Greek and Hebrew. Abelard sought a place in Fulbert's house and in 1115 or 1116 began an affair with Héloïse. The affair interfered with his career, and Abelard himself boasted of his conquest. Once Fulbert found out, he separated them, but they continued to meet in secret. Héloïse became pregnant and was sent by Abelard to be looked after by his family in Brittany, where she gave birth to a son whom she named Astrolabe after the scientific instrument. To appease Fulbert, Abelard proposed a secret marriage so as not to mar his career prospects. Héloïse initially opposed it, but the couple were married. When Fulbert publicly disclosed the marriage, and Héloïse denied it, Abelard sent Héloïse to the convent at Argenteuil, where she had been brought up, in order to protect her from her uncle. Héloïse dressed as a nun and shared the nun's life, though she was not veiled. Fulbert, most probably believing that Abelard wanted to be rid of Héloïse by forcing her to become a nun, arranged for a band of men to break into Abelard's room one night and castrate him. In reaction, Abelard decided to become a monk at the monastery of St. Denis, near Paris. Before doing so, he insisted that Héloïse take vows as a nun. Héloïse sent letters to Abelard, questioning why she must submit to a religious life for which she had no calling. Later life. In the Abbey of St. Denis, the 40-year-old Abelard sought to bury himself as a monk with his woes out of sight. Finding no respite in the cloister, and having gradually turned again to study, he gave in to urgent entreaties, and reopened his school at an unknown priory owned by the monastery. His lectures, now framed in a devotional spirit, and with lectures on theology as well as his previous lectures on logic, were once again heard by crowds of students, and his old influence seemed to have returned. Using his studies of the Bible and, in his view, inconsistent writings of the leaders of the Church as his basis, he wrote Sic Non. No sooner had he published his theological lectures than his adversaries picked up on his rationalistic interpretation of the Trinitarian dogma. Two pupils of Anselm of Laon, Alberic of Rheims and Lotolf of Lombardy, instigated proceedings against Abelard, charging him with the heresy of Sabellius in a provincial synod held at Soissons in 1121. They obtained through irregular procedures an official condemnation of his teaching, and Abelard was made to burn the Theologia himself. He was then sentenced to perpetual confinement in a monastery other than his own, but it seems to have been agreed in advance that this sentence would be revoked almost immediately, because after a few days in the convent of Saint Médard at Soissons, Abelard returned to Saint Denis. Life in his own monastery proved no more congenial than before. For this Abelard himself was partly responsible. He took a sort of malicious pleasure in irritating the monks, as if for the sake of a joke. He cited Bede to prove that the believed founder of the monastery of St. Denis, Dionysius the Areopagite, had been bishop of Corinth, while the other monks relied upon the statement of the abbot Hilduin that he had been bishop of Athens. When this historical heresy led to the inevitable persecution, Abelard wrote a letter to the abbot Adam in which he preferred to the authority of Bede that of Eusebius of Caesarea's Historia Ecclesiastica, and Saint Jerome, according to whom Dionysius, bishop of Corinth, was distinct from Dionysius the Areopagite, bishop of Athens and founder of the abbey. Though, in deference to Bede, he suggested that the Areopagite might also have been bishop of Corinth. Adam accused him of insulting both the monastery and the kingdom of France. Life in the monastery grew intolerable for Abelard, and he was finally allowed to leave. Abelard initially lodged at St. Aile of Provence, where the prior was a friend. Then, after the death of Abbot Adam in March 1122, Abelard was able to gain permission from the new abbot Suger to live in whatever solitary place he wished. In a deserted place near Nogent-sur-Seine in Champagne, he built a cabin of stubble and reeds, and a simple oratory dedicated to the Trinity, and became a hermit. When his retreat became known, students flocked from Paris, and covered the wilderness around him with their tents and huts. He began to teach again there. The oratory was rebuilt in wood and stone and rededicated as the oratory of the Paraclete. Abelard remained at the Paraclete for about 5 years. His combination of the teaching of secular arts with his profession as a monk was heavily criticized by other men of religion, and Abelard contemplated flight outside Christendom altogether. Abelard therefore decided to leave and find another refuge, accepting sometime between 1126 and 1128 an invitation to preside over the Abbey of St. Gildas to rise on the far-off shore of Lower Brittany. The region was inhospitable, the domain a prey to outlaws, the house itself savage and disorderly. Thereto, his relations with the community deteriorated. During this time, however, Abelard came back into contact with Héloïse. In April 1129, Abbot Suger of St. Denis succeeded in his plans to have the nuns, including Héloïse, expelled from the convent at Argenteuil, in order to take over the property for St. Denis. Héloïse had meanwhile become the head of a new foundation of nuns called the Paraclete. Abelard became the abbot of the new community and provided it with a rule and with a justification of the nuns' way of life. In this he emphasized the virtue of literary study. He also provided books of hymns he had composed, and in the early 1130s he and Héloïse composed a collection of their own love letters and religious correspondence. Lack of success at St. Gildas made Abelard decide to take up public teaching again. It is not entirely certain what he then did, but given that John of Salisbury heard Abelard lecture on dialectic in 1136, it is presumed that he returned to Paris and resumed teaching on the Montagne Sainte Geneviève. It is presumed his lectures included logic, at least until 1136, but were mainly concerned with the Bible, Christian doctrine, and ethics. Then he produced further drafts of his Theologia in which he analyzed the sources of belief in the Trinity and praised the pagan philosophers of classical antiquity for the virtues and for the discovery by the use of reason of many fundamental aspects of Christian revelation. At some point in this time Abelard wrote, among other things, his famous Historia Calamitatum. This moved Héloïse to write her first letter, which remains an unsurpassed utterance of human passion and womanly devotion, the first being followed by the 2 other letters, in which she finally accepted the part of resignation, which now as a brother to a sister, Abelard commended to her. Sometime before 1140, Abelard published his masterpiece, Ethica Acetote Ipsum, where he analyzes the idea of sin and that actions are not what a man will be judged for but intentions. During this period, he also read Dialogus inter Philosophum, Judaeum et Christianum, and also Expositio in Epistolam ad Romanos, a commentary on St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, where he expands on the meaning of Christ's life. Conflicts with Saint Bernard. Abelard was to face, however, another challenge which would put a final end to his teaching career. After 1136, it is not clear whether Abelard had stopped teaching, or whether he perhaps continued with all except his lectures on logic until as late as 1141. Whatever the exact timing, a process was instigated by William of St. Thierry, who discovered what he considered to be heresies in some of Abelard's teaching. In spring 1140 he wrote to the Bishop of Chartres and to Bernard of Clairvaux denouncing them. Another, less distinguished, theologian, Thomas of Morony, also produced at the same time a list of Abelard's supposed heresies, perhaps at Bernard's instigation. Bernard's complaint mainly is that Abelard has applied logic where it is not applicable, and that is illogical. Amid pressure from Bernard, Abelard challenged Bernard either to withdraw his accusations, or to make them publicly at the important church council it since planned for the 2nd of June 1141. In so doing, Abelard put himself into the position of the wronged party and forced Bernard to defend himself from the accusation of slander. Bernard avoided this trap, however. On the eve of the council, he called a private meeting of the assembled bishops and persuaded them to condemn, one by one, each of the heretical propositions he attributed to Abelard. When Abelard appeared at the council the next day, he was presented with a list of condemned propositions imputed to him. Refusing to answer to these propositions, Abelard left the assembly, appealed to the Pope, and set off for Rome, hoping that the Pope would be more supportive. However, this hope was unfounded. On the 16th of July 1141, Pope Innocent II issued a bull excommunicating Abelard and his followers and imposing perpetual silence on him, and in a second document he ordered Abelard to be confined in a monastery and his books to be burned. Abelard was saved from this sentence, however, by Peter the Venerable, abbot of Cluny. Abelard had stopped there, on his way to Rome, before the papal condemnation had reached France. Peter persuaded Abelard, already old, to give up his journey and stay at the monastery. Peter managed to arrange a reconciliation with Bernard, to have the sentence of excommunication lifted, and to persuade Innocent that it was enough if Abelard remained under the aegis of Cluny. Abelard was treated not at all as a condemned heretic, but as a revered and wise scholar. He spent his final months at the priory of Saint Marcel, near Chalon-sur-Saône, before he died on the 21st of April 1142. He is said to have uttered the last words, "I don't know," before expiring. He died from a combination of fever and a skin disorder, most likely scurvy. Disputed resting place. Lovers' pilgrimage. Abelard was first buried at Saint Marcel, but his remains were soon carried off secretly to the Paraclete, and given over to the loving care of Héloïse, who in time came herself to rest beside them in 1163. The bones of the pair were moved more than once afterwards, but they were preserved even through the vicissitudes of the French Revolution, and now are presumed to lie in the well-known tomb in Père Lachaise Cemetery in eastern Paris. The transfer of the remains there in 1817 is considered to have considerably contributed to the popularity of that cemetery, at the time still far outside the built-up area of Paris. By tradition, lovers or love-lorn singles leave letters at the crypt, in tribute to the couple or in hope of finding true love. This remains, however, disputed. The oratory of the Paraclete claims Abelard and Héloïse are buried there, and that what exists in Père Lachaise is merely a monument or cenotaph. According to Père Lachaise, the remains of both lovers were transferred from the oratory in the early 19th century and reburied in the famous crypt on the grounds. Others believe that while Abelard is buried in the tomb at Père Lachaise, Héloïse's remains are elsewhere. Philosophy and theology. Philosophical thought. The general importance of Abelard lies in his having fixed more decisively than anyone before him the scholastic manner of philosophizing, with the object of giving a formal, rational expression to received ecclesiastical doctrine. Though his particular interpretations may have been condemned, they were conceived in essentially the same spirit as the general scheme of thought afterwards elaborated in the 13th century with approval from the heads of the Church. He helped to establish the ascendancy of the philosophical authority of Aristotle, which became firmly established in the half-century after his death. It was at this time that the completed Organon, and gradually all the other works of the Greek thinker, first came to be available in the schools. Before his time, Plato's authority was the basis for the prevailing realism. As regards his so-called conceptualism and his attitude to the question of universals, see 1911 Encyclopaedia Britannica. Scholasticism. Outside of his dialectic, it was in ethics that Abelard showed greatest activity of philosophical thought. He stressed the subjective intention as determining, if not the moral character, at least the moral value, of human action. His thought in this direction, anticipating something of modern speculation, is remarkable because his scholastic successes accomplished least in the field of morals, hardly venturing to bring the principles and rules of conduct under pure philosophical discussion, even after they were made fully aware of Aristotle's great ethical inquiries regarding unbaptized who die in infancy. Abelard, in Commentaria in Epistolam Pauli ad Romanos, emphasized the goodness of God and interpreted St. Augustine of Hippo's mildest punishment as the pain of loss at being denied the beatific vision, without hope of obtaining it, but with no additional punishments. His thought contributed to the forming of limbo of infants theory in 12th–13th centuries. Philosophical works Logica Ingredientibus completed before 1121. Petri Abelardi Glossi in Porphyrium c. 1120. Dialectica before 1125. Logica Nostrorum Petitioni Sociorum c. 1124–1125. Tractatus de Intellectibus written before 1128. Sicanon, Theologia Summi Boni, Theologia Christiana, and Theologia Scholarium. His main work on systematic theology, written between 1120 and 1140, and which appeared in a number of versions under a number of titles: Dialogus inter Philosophum Judaeum et Christianum, 1136–1139. Ethica Acito te ipsum, before 1140. Later influence. Abelard was an enormous influence on his contemporaries and the course of medieval philosophical thought, but he has been known in modern times mainly for his connection with Héloïse. Only one of his strictly philosophical works, the ethical treatise Cito te ipsum, had been published before the 19th century, in 1721. It was only with the publication by Cousin in 1836 of the collection entitled Ouvrages inédits d'Abelard that Abelard's philosophical work began to be studied more closely. Cousin's collection gave extracts from the theological work Sicanon, which is an assemblage of what Abelard saw as opposite opinions on doctrinal points culled from the Fathers as a basis for discussion. The collection also includes the Dialectica and commentaries on logical works of Aristotle, Porphyry and Boethius, two works published by Cousin and believed at the time to be by Abelard, the Fragment de Generibus et Speciebus, and also the psychological treatise De Intellectibus, are now believed on upon internal evidence not to be by Abelard himself, but only to have sprung out of his school. A genuine work, the Glossulae Super Porphyrium, from which Charles de Rémusat gave extracts in his monograph Abelard, was published in 1930. Notes from Pope Benedict XVI. During his general audience on 4 November 2009, Pope Benedict XVI talked about St. Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter Abelard to illustrate differences in the monastic and scholastic approaches to theology in the 12th century. The Pope recalled that theology is the search for a rational understanding of the mysteries of Christian revelation, which is believed through faith, faith that seeks intelligibility. But St. Bernard, a representative of monastic theology, emphasized faith, whereas Abelard, who is a scholastic, stressed understanding through reason. For Bernard, faith is based on the testimony of Scripture and on the teaching of the Fathers of the Church. Thus, Bernard found it difficult to agree with Abelard and, in a more general way, with those who would subject the truths of faith to the critical examination of reason, an examination which, in his opinion, posed a grave danger: intellectualism, the relativizing of truth, and the questioning of the truths of faith themselves. Theology for Bernard could be nourished only in contemplative prayer, by the effective union of the heart and mind with God, with only one purpose: to promote the living, intimate experience of God, and aid to loving God ever more and ever better. According to Pope Benedict XVI, an excessive use of philosophy rendered Abelard's doctrine of the Trinity dangerously fragile, and, thus, his idea of God. In the field of morals, his teaching was vague, as he insisted on considering the intention of the subject as the only basis for describing the goodness or evil of moral acts, thereby ignoring the objective meaning and moral value of the acts, resulting in a dangerous subjectivism. But the Pope recognized the great achievements of Abelard, who made a decisive contribution to the development of scholastic theology, which eventually expressed itself in a more mature and fruitful way during the following century, and some of Abelard's insights should not be underestimated. For example, his affirmation that non-Christian religious traditions already contain some form of preparation for welcoming Christ. Pope Benedict XVI concluded that Bernard's theology of the heart and Abelard's theology of reason represent the importance of healthy theological discussion, especially when the questions being debated have not been defined by the magisterium, and humble obedience to the authority of the Church. St. Bernard, and even Abelard himself, always recognized without any hesitation the authority of the magisterium. Abelard showed humility in acknowledging his errors, and Bernard exercised great benevolence. The Pope emphasized, in the field of theology, there should be a balance between architectonic principles, which are given through revelation and which always maintain the primary importance, and the interpretative principles proposed by philosophy, which have an important function, but only as a tool. When the balance breaks down, theological reflection runs the risk of becoming marred by error. It is then up to the magisterium to exercise the needed service to truth, for which it is responsible.